Welcome to part 2 of this video on the context of poetry after 1900. Continuing on from the previous video, we're now going to talk a little bit about another important genre or style of poetry in this era, feminist poetry. Feminist poetry was relatively new in the early 20th century. It was very unusual for poets such as Edna St. Vincent Millay to be openly bisexual or talk about their sexuality in any way. Female poets were beginning to talk about some of the issues that faced women. For example, Anne Sexton wrote about things such as menstruation and abortion, which in the early 20th century would have been seen as quite shocking. And also in the early 20th century, we saw the rise of women's suffrage. And so this is kind of an overview of the early 20th century and feminist poetry. It gets a little bit more complex when we talk about the later 20th century. But for now, let's take a look at an example of a poem by Edna St. Vincent Millay, and try and identify some of these contexts within the poem. So the poem is called I Being Born a Woman. Here, she is satirising how people think women behave around men. She is saying that women obviously must swoon around men, and she's kind of taking the piss of this because at the end she has a very defiant ending where she says she will not succumb to these narrow stereotypes. So we can see in this poem how, although she might be expressing lust or kind of attraction to this man, she's stubbornly stating at the end she finds this kind of emotional frenzy not enough reason to talk to him again. And so this is protesting the way in which women were expected to behave around men, and therefore we can see how she's expressing some of the problems that faced women in the early 20th century. Later on in the 20th century, feminism became far more prominent with Simone de Beauvoir and other European feminist thinkers advocating women's rights. Feminism in contemporary poetry, so poetry now, is far more prevalent, and there are very many more female poets. It's important to mention that Carol Ann Duffy is the first ever poet laureate who is a woman, and writes frequently about the struggles that women face in a patriarchal society. Though it's very important to mention that although there were very few female poets in the early 20th century, they primarily wrote about the problems and their own female experiences. However, because there are so many more women today, they don't have to fight for a place in the canon of poetry, and so female poets today write about many other topics with a fresh and, one could call it, a female perspective. So let's take a look at the comedic poem After the Lunch by Wendy Cope.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you're looking for an amazing A-level English literature resource, join me today in my series of engaging bite-sized video tutorials. Together, we will concisely cover all the important concepts required by your exam board specification, as well as practically apply what we have learnt through exam-style questions, focusing on how best to structure your answers in order to maximise marks. See you soon, and together, let's make A-level English literature a walk in the park.